Today is Saturday, May 9th, 2020, which means it's Garaaga Saturday. Hello, fiendlings, how the hell are you? I just put up another episode of Derelict Trident for the patrons, so I'm still hard at work getting the book recorded. It's taking a lot of time because birds love to sing between 0530 and 800, lawnmowers and fucking leaf blowers from 800 to 1400, and then neighbors doing construction or other insanity until 1700. So basically, recording as catch can. I'm thinking I just need to bite the bullet and pull a couple of all-nighters to get this narration finished, but that's not really practical. I'll figure something out. I always do. Despite the COVID 19 situation, my software project continues moving forward, and the deadline for a field test is rapidly approaching. As such, my focus is kind of all over the place. Because I don't multitask well, I'm now choosing days of the week to get certain types of work done. And then, if I get things done early, I can jump into something else. Hence why I generated and uploaded 22 YouTube videos in one day for the Derelict Saga, so I wouldn't have to touch that feed for a few weeks. That sucked, by the way. How do you handle multitasking? Do you love it, loathe it, or is it something that doesn't even appear on your radar? I'm curious. That said, it's time for us to conclude Eason's story, so let's get to it. Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 4 of Legends of Garaaga. For the first time since he'd left the cave, Eason felt full. The fever that had plagued him since he fled the village was still burning, but with less intensity. Meat, bread, onions, the joy of the food had lifted his spirits. That and the fact he would soon see Triani. He followed Asani through the choked city streets. Market Day, Asani had explained, was celebrated in Akkad with a fervor. Every Akkadian, from the poorest to the wealthiest, joined together on Market Day. They passed city dwellers carrying large woven baskets on their heads or pushing carts filled with strange delicacies. They are coming back from the market, Asani explained. Most will drop their load and return for another. As they walked, Eason was in constant wonder at the multicolored robes and the great diversity of the people. Even in Lothal, the largest village he knew, the people all looked the same, except for the visiting outlanders like Asani. But Akkad seemed to have nothing but outlanders. Eason, clothed in his simple wool robe, felt out of place. The city gate loomed. Men with spears walked along the high city walls, glancing into the crowd. Eason tapped Asani's shoulder and pointed to them. Guards, he explained. They watch for trouble and Akkad's enemies. But today, Asani yelled over the din, they are enjoying themselves like everyone else. The market was outside the city walls. Eason stared in disbelief at the number of people swirling around the booths and the tradesmen. He'd never seen this many people in one place before. A tall man, black as coal, yelled to the crowd in a deep voice. Through the moving bodies, Eason saw the man gesturing toward an array of animals in cages. Multicolored birds cawed and squawked. Asani grabbed his elbow. This way, the man shouted. Eason allowed Asani to lead him deeper into the crowd of people. He bumped into and against men, women, children of all different races and dress. They finally reached the edge of the crowd, and Eason saw what Asani had been leading him toward. An aged, slender man stood at a booth. The old man smiled at Asani. 4 upper teeth were missing from the right side of his mouth. A small lapis stone dangled from his ear. Hanging from the top of the booth were great loops of stunning beauty. Silver chains had been threaded through pieces of lapis. Eason's mouth dropped open at the sight. What think you? Asani asked. So beautiful. Yes, all the beads you have left would not purchase a single piece. Eason shook his head. How much? Asani clapped Eason on the shoulder. One of my trips to Lothal might purchase a piece or two. Asani leaned close to his ear. But this tradesman and I have an understanding. I take his necklaces to Lothal and trade for metal. Eason nodded. So you get the silver and gold from Lothal so he may make them? Yes. Asani stared at them with pride. I make it possible for him to keep creating beauty. Eason smiled. You are a good man, Hassani. Let's hope Inky thinks so. The old man pointed at Hassani and spoke. Hassani nodded. Hold out your hands. Eason reached forward, his palms up. The old man lifted one of the loops and turned to place it in Eason's hands. He stopped. His eyes stared into the ruined flesh of Eason's left palm. The old man dropped the necklace to the ground and grabbed Eason's hand. Eason tried to pull back, but Hassani was right behind him. The old man muttered something, his eyes blinking at the symbol. He looked up and stared into Eason's face, and then pushed him away. Hassani yelled at the old man. The jeweler raised his hands and then pointed at Eason. He screamed something, bent down, retrieved the necklace, and placed it back with the others. Come, Hassani said. He placed an arm around Eason's neck and led him away from the booth. Did I do something wrong? Eason asked. I do not understand, Hassani said. The mark on your palm frightened him. He didn't look frightened, Eason said. He looked angry. Yes. Eason turned to look behind him. The old man was glaring at him and breaking down his booth. Never mind that, Hassani said. I have other wonders to show you. The cool air had evaporated as the sun rose higher and higher in the sky. When it was at its zenith, Eason's fever returned with a vengeance. He was sweating and chilled to the bone while he burned. Hassani had cut short their market trip and insisted they head back to his home. Despite the strange animals, the myriad of fruits and vegetables, and the dazzling array of beads and baubles, Eason agreed. The old man's angry face was fresh in his mind. Now for the first time since leaving Lothal, he wished he understood Akkadian. The man had seen the symbol before, that much was obvious. But why had it angered him? He'd asked Hassani several times, but the merchant either didn't want to explain or was unable. As they made their way back through the Akkad streets, Hassani pointed out the various temples to the gods. The structures were incredibly ornate, filigreed with metal and terracotta. It was difficult to focus on their beauty, though, with the old man's face tugging at his consciousness. We see your friend Tupšarrum now. Eason felt his heart hammer with excitement. Now? Yes, Hassani said. Despite the growing fever and the coughing fits that made his vision waver, the idea of seeing Triani, or whatever he was called now, renewed his strength. Just a little longer, and then he too could rest. Where are we going? To the temple of Nabu and Nidaba, Hassani grinned. Your Tupšarrum friend worships them. Hassani wrinkled his nose. And by the smell of him, I'd say he's not left the temple for a long time. Triani. He kept repeating the name to himself as he followed the riverbank to Lothal. The journey had taken 3 days. 3 days of walking as fast as he could and sleeping only when his legs refused to support his weight. 3 days of feeling hunted. He felt them on his trail, the destroyers of Gujaratine pursuing him, intent on destroying the last keeper and the legend. Triani's name echoed in his mind with every step, but it was always Hanar's voice that spoke to him when he closed his eyes. Her marred and mutilated face whispered the name again and again. As the fever burned inside him, her voice and Triani's name burned in his mind and drove him forward. When Eason had reached Lothal, it had taken him nearly 2 days to find the Waymaster he sought. Triani and his brother Tunia had left the village as young men. The two had traveled to Lothal to seek their fortune when Eason was barely old enough to stand. Tunia returned every few seasons with tales of Lothal and the strange boats that brought trade. While Tunia had become a Waymaster in Lothal, Triani had left with one of the merchants, bound for Akkad. Tunia had not seen him again. When asked why Triani had sought to travel to Akkad, Tunia had grinned. He saw the merchants and the Waymasters make their marks. He wanted to learn how. That had been more seasons ago than Eason could count. After the cave and his return to the village, Eason knew at once he must find Triani. Only Triani could keep Rashim's legend alive. To find Triani, he had to first find Tunia. Lothal was hardly the size of Akkad, but his searches for Tunia proved futile. The man had disappeared. It wasn't until he started asking the other waymasters that he found out what had happened. Tunia and his family had been found dead in their home. Tunia's body had been skinned like an animal. Upon hearing the story, Eason had been frantic. Without Tunia in tow, it would be impossible to gain passage to Akkad, let alone discover Triani's whereabouts. That is when he found Hassani. Hassani had been bartering with a waymaster who had told Eason of Tunia's fate. As Hassani placed pieces of lapis on one side of the scale, the waymaster placed a weight. The men would wait until the scales stopped moving and repeat the process until the scales balanced. The two men would then converse, Hassani in his broken speech and the waymaster in his raspy voice. Once agreed on a price, Hassani took out a stylus and pressed marks into a clay tablet. The sight was enough to dispel Eason's hopelessness. Hassani had been hesitant to offer him passage to Akkad, but the pouch of village treasure Eason carried was enough to convince him. As the boat was loaded with cargo, Eason stayed by the dock and watched Hassani fuss over how it was stowed. That was when he noticed the small group of red-robed men. They kept their distance in silence, but all five stared at him with a predator's lust. He knew at once they were the same group that had murdered his village, his wife-to-be. Men who worshipped a monster, men who would gut him and silence him forever. Adrenal-laden fear gripped him, leaving him shuddering and shaking on the dock. He closed his eyes, seeing Hanar's face, and the fear was gone once more. Rage had replaced it, rage and the thirst for vengeance. As Hassani's men finished loading the cargo, Eason boarded the boat, his eyes still on the small group of men. "You know them?" Hassani asked. Eason didn't look at the merchant, but grunted. "I know them," he whispered. "They are your friends?" Eason shook his head. "Good that you don't like them," Hassani said. "They look criminal." "They are." Hassani clapped him on the shoulder. "We leave now." He spit on the dock. "We go to Akkad. You need never see them again." As the boat left the dock, Eason waved. The murderers had done nothing but continue their stare. They had lost. They had pursued him ever since he left Gujaratine and failed to kill him. He would find Triani. He would avenge Hanar. The sickness had strengthened during the voyage. Despite Hassani's constant worrying over his passenger, Eason's health had worsened. The fever and coughing fits left him barely able to move. He had escaped Garaaga's followers, but he could not escape the illness. Once in Akkad, it had only taken Hassani a few hours to locate Triani. According to Hassani, there weren't many markers of his skill. The narrow street opened up into a wide courtyard. Eason stopped and stared in wonder at the ziggurat. It was not the largest he'd seen, but the only one with so many symbols carved into the stone. Hassani seemed to notice he'd stopped and turned back to him. "A sight, yes? It's strange. These Tupšarrum would no doubt hide the entire temple in their marks if they could." "How did they do this?" "Ladders. They made ladders or stood on the shoulders of other worshippers so they could reach the highest parts of the temple." Eason shook his head. "It is beautiful." Hassani tugged at his beard. "Come, Eason, let's meet your Triani." When they walked up the steps into the top level of the ziggurat, Eason lost his breath. The temple walls were covered in clay tablets bearing strange markings. In the center of the room sat 3 stone tables. Behind the center table, a man dressed in crimson and yellow robes stood hunched over, a stylus in his hands. The man's robes were smeared with clay dust, his skin filthy with the leavings, as he pressed strange symbols into being. Hassani bowed to the man, who did not look up. "Tupšarrum," Hassani said. The man finished pressing a symbol into the tablet before him and raised his eyes. The man did not speak, but nodded. Hassani spoke in Akkadian and then pointed to Eason. The man who called himself Tupšarrum stood to his full height, his vertebrae cracking in the silent room. "Little brother," the man said, "you seek Triani." Eason smiled. "Yes, big brother, I seek you." The priest bowed. I am Triani, although that name means nothing here.
You are brother to Tunia.
I am.
Tunia is no more, big brother. He and his family were murdered.
A flash of emotion crossed Triani's face, but disappeared as quickly as it had come. Is that what you came to tell me?
No, Eason said. I have news.
Triani looked over at Hassani and spoke in Akkadian. After a moment, Hassani tapped Eason on the shoulder. I leave you two. Triani will bring you to my house when you are finished.
Thank you, Eason said with a bow.
By Inky, you have found what you sought, Hassani said. He turned and left the quiet, dark temple. Triani waited until the man's footsteps could no longer be heard. It is not wise to keep Akkadians waiting, young one. They have patience, that one more than most, but they always have their own matters to attend to. The older man laid the stylus down on the stone surface, made a bow to the table, and then shuffled around it. He offered Eason his hand. Eason pushed his forward, and the two shook. Triani frowned. He turned over Eason's hand and stared at the wound. Keeper?
Yes, Eason said. I am the last.
Triani clucked his tongue. You should know better than to believe in such.
What?
Triani pointed at the walls. Do you see? These may look like nothing more than scratches to you, young one, but they are words from God. They are truth, not like legend, not like myth. They cannot lie.
What do they say?
They tell of market days, of extraordinary events that take place in Akkad and elsewhere. Reports from the far reaches, as far as
Triani wiped sweat from his brow. His robe came away brown and red.
What is your name, Keeper?
Eason.
Triani nodded. Go back to your village, Eason, or stay here, but live like a man, not a priest bearing to a false god.
Eason felt a flush of anger from his belly. You do not wish to hear my news?
Triani chuckled. What could be of importance that happened so far from Lothal, let alone Akkad? There was nothing worthy of Tupšarrum's attention.
Eason clenched his fists. The fever was forgotten now. The sickness, the illness that had plagued him since he left the village, paled in comparison to the hate he felt rise within him. Destruction. Death. Garaaga. The thin, mocking smile on Triani's face collapsed into a flat line.
What say you?
Gujarratine is no more, marker, Eason spat. When I left, it was nothing more than cinders and blood.
Triani stared down at the ground. I am sorry to hear, Eason.
There are none left. I am the last that claim her.
Gujarratine.
Triani stared up at the high ceiling. The torches on the wall flickered, driving crisscrossing shadows across it.
I have created that word, Eason. It lives as long as there are words for it.
Eason raised his hand and showed the mark burned into his skin. Then make this into a word, marker. Eason walked forward, hand still raised. He placed it close to Triani's dust-covered face. Create it.
Triani clucked his tongue.
Who is responsible? Eason lowered his hand. Garaaga.
Triani shook his head. Garaaga is a myth, a nothing.
The people that believe in Garaaga are real enough, Triani. He choked down a sob. They raised Gujarratine, gutted the men and women, set fire to the children, left nothing of our village. He wiped a tear from his face. My betrothed was skinned like an animal and left for the ants and the birds.
Nambu, Triani whispered. How do you?
Destruction of me, the keepers, Rashim. Who else could it have been?
Please sit, brother.
The older man knelt and gently placed himself on the floor, legs crossed. Eason sighed and followed suit. For a moment, the priest stared only at the clay floor. With his index finger, he drew a symbol in the dust. the open eye, its lid spread wide apart. What do you keep, little Eason? A cough rattled his rib cage as he tried to speak. Specks of blood flew onto his robe. I keep Rashim's legend, as told me by Ramal, the last keeper. Triani nodded, his face sad. You are dying, little one. I know, big brother. Tell me of Garaaga, child. Tell me why I should believe in a legend. Eason told the story, word for word, his catechism as Ramal had related. He left out nothing. Rashim traveling into the cave, dispatching the creature after suffering great wounds, and the final words of the legend. The ruby wounds, but it is the mind that kills. Triani stayed silent, barely breathing, as Eason repeated the legend. When Eason had finished, Triani drew a series of symbols, a spiral with a hook attached. Have you seen this before, little one? Another cough rattled his chest. He swallowed blood, fighting the urge to retch. The symbol. He nodded. Yes. Where? It took him a moment to answer. The image of that symbol carved into Hanar's boneless, naked flesh. Hanar would have screamed as they carved it into her. Had she called for him or cursed him as the assailants mutilated her? On Hanar's back, he whispered, on what was left of her. I am sorry, Eason. So sorry. The two were silent for a moment. Triani shifted his fingers across the dust and wiped away the symbol. Ramal carved the mark into you. Eason nodded. The old man shuffled off into the forest to die. Yes. And you returned to the village and found bodies, young, old, women, men, all dead, all mutilated. The women worse than the men. Naboo, Triani whispered. Eason wiped away a tear. Another coughing fit gripped him, and he swallowed more blood. We are all that's left. Do you know how they found Gujaratine? Tunia was murdered a few days before the village was destroyed. My brother, Triani said, and stared down at the floor. He loved to tell stories, loved to drink. Eason said nothing. You left the village? I left the village and followed the river bank. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I made my way to Lothal as fast as I could and found Hassani. Triani drew a set of symbols in the dust. Eason watched in fascination as the man's fingers danced, bringing forth dashes, dots, and shapes. They flowed like water. You will tell me the story again, Eason. The legend, as well as the fall of Gujaratine. Triani looked up from the dust. As long as you have voice, you will repeat it to me. Something tapped against Eason's shoulder. He opened his eyes with a start. Triani's tired face smiled in the torchlight. It is late, little brother. Very late. Did we? It is done, Triani said. I am too tired to take you to your friend's house, and we cannot sleep here. Then where? Come, little brother, follow me. Eason struggled to his feet. The fever racked him anew. He hadn't eaten since the morning meal, and yet he knew the turmoil in his belly was not from lack of food. As he had repeated the legend again and again to Triani, listening to his own voice weaken with each word, the burning of his flesh and of his stomach had increased. He felt as though someone had set his insides alight. Triani stretched out his hand, and Eason took it. The Tupšarrum led him to the rear of the temple and a flight of steep stairs. Where? Be silent, little brother, Triani whispered. I don't want them to hear us. Who? I don't know. Someone climbed the steps of the temple, but dared not enter. I heard them as I was finishing the last tablet. A shiver racked Eason's body. You don't think... Did anyone see your mark, besides your friend? His wife, perhaps, or a man at the market? Triani halted and turned. Even in the dim, flickering torchlight, Eason could see the fear in the man's eyes. Describe him. Purveyor of lapis necklaces. He saw the mark in my skin and... Yes, Triani said. Come, follow me and be very quiet. The two men made their way down the steep steps. The world tried to spin on him. He wavered and put a hand on Triani's shoulder to steady himself. The old man stiffened and stopped his progress. When Eason felt sure he could go on, he squeezed. Triani started down the steps once more, Eason's hand loose on his shoulder. The torchlight had all but vanished once they reached the bottom of the steps. The moonless night was pitch black, as were the shadows of the temple. Lay down on the other side of the steps, little brother. No one will be able to see you there. Where are you going? I will find your friend Hassani. He might be able to get you out of the city. Eason shook his head. No, he whispered. You must protect the tablets, the story, the legend. But listen, Triani. I am dying anyway. Eason clapped a hand on the older man's shoulder. Will they harm a priest? They should harm no one. Will they harm a priest? Triani shrugged. It is absolutely forbidden. Eason smiled. Go back to the temple. Guard the tablets. He leaned forward and whispered into Triani's ear. You are all that's left of us, Keeper. He pointed back up the steps. Go. The Tupšarrum hesitated. For a moment, Eason wasn't sure if the man would heed his command. Finally, Triani turned and made his way up the steps. The cough that had threatened to break the silence of the last several minutes finally made its way from his lungs. The sound was loud enough to make his ears ring. He gurgled on the bloody phlegm and finally managed to spit it out into the ground. He stared at the stars. Without trees or clouds to mar the sky, they seemed endless in number. A sudden glow on the city wall told him he'd been found. Shadows danced as a torch grew closer. With you, Hanar. I'm sorry, Hassani's voice said from behind. Eason turned. 3 men stood with Hassani. The old man from the market held a blade in his hands. The other 2 were swaddled in dark robes, their faces and forms indistinguishable from shadow. In the light cast by the old man's torch, Eason could see the bruises and cuts on Hassani's face. Never meant for you to get hurt, my friend. Eason smiled. For Hanar, he whispered to Hassani. He stared at the old man. For Rashim! At the mention of the name, the old man screamed and thrust the blade through Eason's chest. Eason's eyes rose to the top of the temple, where a shadowy form stood watching. As the other men unsheathed their blades and hacked at his body, Eason stared up at the stars until long after his last breath.